Introduction. Can you actually survive on minimum wage in America? In this video, we're comparing the minimum wage to the real cost of living in every U.S. state. We'll look at the living wage, what a single adult actually needs to get by, the percentage of income swallowed by rent, and the dollar gap between minimum pay and minimum survival. The results are eye-opening. All data is approximate and based on 2024 to 2025 estimates. Alabama. Alabama has no state minimum wage law, so the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour applies. Yet the living wage for a single adult here is about $17.41 per hour, a gap of $10.16 per hour. Rent eats up roughly 52% of a minimum wage worker's income, making even this lower-cost southern state a struggle on base pay. Alaska. Alaska's minimum wage sits at $11.73 per hour, above the federal floor and indexed to inflation. However, the living wage is approximately $18.96 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.23 per hour. With remote geography driving up the cost of goods, rent consumes about 48% of a minimum wage paycheck. High heating bills in winter make the squeeze even tighter. Arizona. Arizona's minimum wage is $14.35 per hour, one of the higher rates in the country. The living wage for a single adult is around $19.17 per hour, creating a gap of $4.82 per hour. Rent still takes about 42% of minimum wage earnings. Phoenix's booming housing market has been pushing costs up rapidly in recent years. Arkansas. Arkansas set its minimum wage at $11 per hour, well above the federal baseline. The living wage here is roughly $16.89 per hour, resulting in a gap of $5.89 per hour. Rent accounts for about 40% of a minimum wage worker's income. As one of the most affordable states overall, Arkansas still leaves minimum wage earners short. California. California leads with a $16 per hour minimum wage, the highest among large states. But the living wage is a staggering $27.32 per hour, a gap of $11.32 per hour. Rent devours approximately 53% of minimum wage income. In cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, even the higher state minimum barely scratches the surface of housing costs. Colorado. Colorado's minimum wage is $14.42 per hour, adjusted annually for inflation. The living wage for a single adult is about $21.44 per hour, leaving a $7.02 per hour shortfall. Rent claims roughly 47% of minimum wage earnings. Denver's rapid growth has turned what was once an affordable mountain state into one of the pricier places in the West. Connecticut. Connecticut's minimum wage stands at $15.69 per hour, among the nation's highest. The living wage is approximately $22.48 per hour, creating a gap of $6.79 per hour. About 50% of a minimum wage worker's income goes to rent. Connecticut's proximity to New York City inflates costs in the southern part of the state significantly. Delaware. Delaware pays a minimum wage of $13.25 per hour. The living wage here is about $19.62 per hour, producing a gap of $6.37 per hour. Rent takes approximately 45% of minimum wage income. Despite being a small state, Delaware's costs vary significantly. Wilmington's proximity to Philadelphia drives prices higher in the north. Florida. Florida's minimum wage has risen to $13 per hour and is on track to reach $15 by 2026. The living wage is around $20.67 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.67 per hour. Rent eats up about 51% of minimum wage earnings. Miami and Tampa have seen explosive rent increases, making Florida increasingly unaffordable for low-wage workers. Georgia. Georgia's state minimum wage is technically $5.15 per hour, but the federal floor of $7.25 per hour applies to most workers. The living wage is approximately $18.71 per hour, a huge $11.46 per hour gap. Rent consumes around 54% of minimum wage income. Atlanta's surging housing market has made the gap feel even wider for residents in the metro area. Hawaii. Hawaii's minimum wage is $14 per hour, but the living wage is a jaw-dropping $28.89 per hour, one of the highest gaps in the nation at $14.89 per hour. Rent takes an astonishing 63% of minimum wage income. Island geography means nearly everything is imported, from food to building materials, making Hawaii one of the toughest states to survive on low wages. Idaho. Idaho sticks with the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is about $17.67 per hour, creating a gap of $10.42 per hour. Rent takes up roughly 49% of minimum wage income. Boise has experienced one of the fastest growing housing markets in the country, making Idaho far less affordable than its reputation suggests. Illinois. Illinois has a $14 per hour minimum wage with plans to continue increasing it. The living wage is around $20.58 per hour, resulting in a $6.58 per hour gap. Rent claims about 44% of minimum wage earnings. Chicago drives much of the state's high cost of living, though downstate areas remain significantly more affordable. Indiana. Indiana uses the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is approximately $17.21 per hour, producing a $9.96 per hour gap. About 47% of minimum wage income goes to rent. While Indiana is considered a low-cost state, the federal minimum hasn't been raised since 2009, making even modest living expenses a challenge. Iowa. Iowa's minimum wage matches the federal rate of $7.25 per hour. The living wage here is about $17.08 per hour, creating a gap of $9.83 per hour. Rent consumes roughly 43% of minimum wage income. Iowa's cost of living is below the national average, but the gap between minimum and living wage is still nearly $10 an hour. Kansas. Kansas relies on the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is around $17.14 per hour, leaving a gap of $9.89 per hour. About 44% of minimum wage earnings go to rent. Kansas City straddles two states, and workers on the Kansas side earn less than their Missouri counterparts just minutes away. Kentucky. Kentucky's minimum wage is $7.25 per hour, the federal baseline. The living wage is approximately $17.32 per hour, yielding a gap of $10.07 per hour. Rent takes up about 46% of minimum wage income. Despite being among the more affordable states, Kentucky's reliance on the unchanged federal minimum puts enormous pressure on low-wage workers. Louisiana. Louisiana has no state minimum wage, defaulting to the federal $7.25 per hour. The living wage is about $17.52 per hour, a gap of $10.27 per hour. Rent devours roughly 50% of minimum wage income. New Orleans tourism drives up housing costs in the city, while rural areas struggle with some of the highest poverty rates in the nation. Maine. Maine's minimum wage is $14.15 per hour, indexed to inflation. The living wage for a single adult is approximately $19.39 per hour, creating a gap of $5.24 per hour. Rent takes about 44% of minimum wage income. Maine's rural character keeps some costs lower, but Portland and coastal areas have seen significant housing price increases in recent years. Maryland. Maryland's minimum wage is $15 per hour. The living wage is about $22.09 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.09 per hour. Rent consumes roughly 49% of minimum wage income. Proximity to Washington, D.C. makes much of Central Maryland expensive, while the Eastern Shore and Western regions remain more affordable. Massachusetts. Massachusetts boasts a $15 per hour minimum wage. The living wage is around $24.91 per hour, leaving a $9.91 per hour gap. Rent takes about 55% of minimum wage earnings. Boston's notoriously expensive housing market means that even a relatively high minimum wage falls far short of what's needed to live comfortably. Michigan. Michigan's minimum wage is $10.56 per hour, though recent court rulings may push it higher. The living wage for a single adult is about $18.01 per hour, producing a gap of $7.45 per hour. Rent takes approximately 45% of minimum wage income. Detroit's affordable housing contrasts sharply with rising costs in Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. Minnesota. Minnesota's minimum wage is $10.85 per hour for large employers. The living wage is approximately $19.84 per hour, leaving a gap of $8.99 per hour. Rent consumes about 46% of minimum wage income. The Twin Cities metro area drives up statewide averages, while Greater Minnesota remains considerably cheaper. Mississippi. Mississippi has no state minimum wage law, so the federal $7.25 per hour applies. The living wage is approximately $16.76 per hour, among the lowest in the nation, but the gap is still $9.51 per hour. Rent consumes about 48% of minimum wage income. Even in one of America's most affordable states, minimum wage workers face a significant shortfall. Missouri. Missouri's minimum wage is $12.30 per hour, recently increased by voter initiative. The living wage is about $17.56 per hour, creating a gap of $5.26 per hour. Rent takes roughly 41% of minimum wage income. Kansas City and St. Louis have moderate costs, making Missouri one of the better states for minimum wage workers, though the gap persists. Montana. Montana's minimum wage is $10.30 per hour, indexed to inflation. The living wage is about $17.89 per hour, creating a gap of $7.59 per hour. Rent takes roughly 45% of minimum wage income. Montana's housing market surged during the pandemic as remote workers flocked to the state, dramatically raising costs for longtime residents. Nebraska. Nebraska's minimum wage is $12 per hour, rising toward $15 by 2026 after a voter-approved initiative. The living wage is about $17.68 per hour, leaving a gap of $5.68 per hour. Rent takes roughly 41% of minimum wage income. Omaha and Lincoln are growing, but overall, Nebraska remains one of the more affordable Midwestern states. Nevada. Nevada's minimum wage is $12 per hour. The living wage is approximately $19.03 per hour, producing a gap of $7.03 per hour. Rent takes about 47% of minimum wage income. Las Vegas service workers form a huge share of the workforce, and rising rents in the metro area have made it harder for tipped and low-wage earners to keep up. New Hampshire. New Hampshire uses the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour, though most employers pay above it due to a tight labor market. The living wage is about $20.39 per hour, a gap of $13.14 per hour on paper. Rent takes roughly 53% of minimum wage income. In practice, few workers actually earn the federal minimum here, but the official gap remains one of the largest in New England. New Jersey. New Jersey's minimum wage is $15.13 per hour, among the highest in the nation. The living wage is approximately $22.21 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.08 per hour. Rent consumes about 50% of minimum wage income. Northern New Jersey's proximity to New York City keeps housing costs elevated, while southern areas are somewhat more affordable. New Mexico. New Mexico's minimum wage is $12 per hour. The living wage for a single adult is about $17.94 per hour, creating a gap of $5.94 per hour. Rent takes approximately 44% of minimum wage income. Albuquerque and Santa Fe have different cost profiles. Santa Fe's arts-driven tourism pushes its local costs notably higher. New York. New York's minimum wage ranges from $15 to $16 per hour, depending on the region, with New York City at the top. The living wage statewide is about $25.69 per hour, a gap of roughly $10 per hour. Rent consumes approximately 58% of minimum wage income. In Manhattan, even workers earning well above minimum wage can barely cover a studio apartment. North Carolina. North Carolina relies on the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is about $18.14 per hour, resulting in a $10.89 per hour gap. Rent takes roughly 49% of minimum wage income. The Research Triangle area has boomed with tech jobs, but minimum wage workers in cities like Raleigh and Charlotte are being priced out of their own neighborhoods. North Dakota. North Dakota uses the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is about $17.58 per hour, leaving a gap of $10.33 per hour. Rent takes roughly 44% of minimum wage income. The oil boom brought both jobs and cost of living spikes to western parts of the state, though some areas have cooled in recent years. Ohio. Ohio's minimum wage is $10.45 per hour, adjusted for inflation each year. The living wage is about $17.84 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.39 per hour. Rent consumes roughly 42% of minimum wage earnings. Ohio offers a moderate cost of living, but cities like Columbus are growing fast, putting upward pressure on housing prices. Oklahoma. Oklahoma follows the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is approximately $16.91 per hour, creating a gap of $9.66 per hour. Rent takes about 43% of minimum wage income. Oklahoma City and Tulsa remain relatively affordable compared to other metros, but low wages still leave workers with thin margins. Oregon. Oregon's minimum wage is $14.70 per hour in the standard tier, with the Portland Metro at $15.95 per hour. The living wage statewide is about $21.31 per hour, creating a gap of around $6.61 per hour. Rent claims approximately 46% of minimum wage income. Portland's housing crisis has been well documented, with homelessness rates among the highest in the nation. Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania still uses the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour, one of the few northeastern states to do so. The living wage is approximately $19.42 per hour, a gap of $12.17 per hour. Rent devours about 52% of minimum wage income. Philadelphia's housing costs are rising while rural Pennsylvania wages remain stagnant, creating a stark divide within the state. Rhode Island. Rhode Island's minimum wage is $14 per hour. The living wage is about $21.53 per hour, leaving a gap of $7.53 per hour. Rent takes approximately 50% of minimum wage income. As the smallest state by area, Rhode Island's costs are heavily influenced by the Providence Metro and proximity to Boston. South Carolina. South Carolina has no state minimum wage, so the federal $7.25 per hour applies. The living wage is approximately $17.88 per hour, creating a gap of $10.63 per hour. Rent takes about 49% of minimum wage income. Charleston's tourism-fueled growth has pushed housing costs well above the state average, while inland areas remain cheaper, but also lower income. South Dakota. South Dakota's minimum wage is $11.20 per hour, indexed to inflation. The living wage is about $17.34 per hour, producing a gap of $6.14 per hour. Rent takes roughly 42% of minimum wage income. Sioux Falls is growing rapidly and driving up local costs, but much of rural South Dakota remains quite affordable. Tennessee. Tennessee has no state minimum wage, defaulting to the federal $7.25 per hour. The living wage is approximately $17.78 per hour, leaving a gap of $10.53 per hour. Rent takes about 49% of minimum wage income. Nashville's booming economy has made it one of the fastest-growing cities in America, but wage growth for low earners hasn't kept pace with housing. Texas. Texas follows the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour and has no state minimum wage law. The living wage is about $18.23 per hour, producing a gap of $10.98 per hour. Rent takes approximately 48% of minimum wage income. Despite Texas's reputation for affordability, cities like Austin and Dallas have seen dramatic rent increases in recent years. Utah. Utah follows the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is about $18.41 per hour, creating a gap of $11.16 per hour. Rent consumes roughly 50% of minimum wage income. Salt Lake City's tech-driven growth has made Utah's housing market one of the most competitive in the Mountain West. Vermont. Vermont's minimum wage is $13.67 per hour, indexed to inflation. The living wage is about $19.62 per hour, leaving a gap of $5.95 per hour. Rent takes approximately 46% of minimum wage income. Vermont's rural character keeps some costs lower, but limited housing supply in popular areas like Burlington drives prices higher. Virginia. Virginia's minimum wage is $12.41 per hour. The living wage is approximately $20.38 per hour, producing a gap of $7.97 per hour. Rent takes about 50% of minimum wage income. Northern Virginia's proximity to Washington, D.C., makes it one of the most expensive regions in the Southeast, while southwestern Virginia is far more affordable. Washington. Washington state has one of the highest minimum wages at $16.28 per hour, indexed to inflation. The living wage is about $23.11 per hour, leaving a $6.83 per hour gap. Rent takes roughly 48% of minimum wage income. Seattle's booming tech sector has pushed housing prices to astronomical levels. The workers across the state benefit from the higher wage floor. West Virginia. West Virginia's minimum wage is $8.75 per hour, modestly above the federal floor. The living wage is about $16.92 per hour, creating a gap of $8.17 per hour. Rent takes approximately 45% of minimum wage income. West Virginia has one of the lowest costs of living in the nation, but also some of the lowest incomes, keeping the squeeze tight for low-wage workers. Wisconsin. Wisconsin uses the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. The living wage is approximately $17.75 per hour, leaving a gap of $10.50 per hour. Rent takes about 44% of minimum wage income. Milwaukee and Madison have growing economies, but minimum wage workers in these cities face rising rents that outpace their stagnant pay. Wyoming. Wyoming's state minimum wage is $5.15 per hour, but the federal floor of $7.25 per hour applies to most workers. The living wage is about $17.36 per hour, creating a gap of $10.11 per hour. Rent takes roughly 44% of minimum wage income. Wyoming's small population and energy economy create pockets of high cost near resource towns, while much of the state remains sparsely populated and relatively cheap. Worst gaps. Federal minimum states. The 20 states still using the federal minimum of $7.25 per hour have the worst wage-to-cost gaps. States like Texas, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina see gaps exceeding $10 per hour. Workers in these states earn about $15,080 per year before taxes, well below the poverty line for most urban areas. The federal minimum hasn't been raised since July 2009, making it the longest period without an increase in history. Best ratios. States closing the gap. Washington, California, and Oregon come closest to closing the gap between minimum and living wages. Washington's gap of $6.83 per hour is among the smallest in the country. States with inflation-indexed minimums tend to perform better over time. However, no state's minimum wage fully meets the MIT Living Wage Calculator's threshold for a single adult, meaning nowhere in America can you comfortably survive on minimum wage alone. Rent burden, the biggest squeeze. Housing experts say rent should be no more than 30% of income, yet in every single state, minimum wage workers spend far more than that. Hawaii tops the list at 63%, followed by New York at 58%, and Massachusetts at 55%. Even in the most affordable states like Mississippi and Arkansas, rent still takes over 40% of a minimum wage paycheck. Conclusion: the data tells a clear story. Minimum wage falls short of a living wage in every single U.S. state. The average gap is about $9 per hour nationwide, and rent alone consumes 40 to 63% of minimum wage income, depending on where you live. Whether you live in a high-cost state like California or a low-cost state like Mississippi, minimum wage was never designed to be, and currently isn't, a livable wage. Thanks for watching, and drop a comment telling us what your state's minimum wage gets you.